Welcome to this edition of the Head That Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McKinney. This is episode number 78 of the podcast. And in this edition of the podcast, I want to talk about the front runners for NFL MVP, Russell Wilson and Lamar Jackson. It seems like the MVP in the NFL this year is down to these two individual star quarterbacks. Barring a late surge by Drew Brees, and after Monday night, I think he should start to be in the discussion. I think one of these two, Lamar Jackson or Russell Wilson, will be the definitive MVP this season. Let's look at the stats of both of these star quarterbacks this year. Russell Wilson, 28 touchdowns, 5 interceptions, a 67% completion percentage. Lamar Jackson, 33 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, 66.6 completion percentage, over 1,100 rushing yards this season, which is extremely great when you consider he's a quarterback, not a running back. I think the case for Russell Wilson for MVP is this. He is the one carrying this team. The Seahawks have to play close games because they're not who they used to be. They don't have Richard Sherman on defense. They don't have the Legion of Boom anymore. He doesn't have Doug Baldwin. He doesn't have Marshawn Lynch. He doesn't have Jimmy Graham. This year he's throwing to the likes of Tyler Lockhart, DJ Metcalf, and his running back is Chris Carson, who is good, but he's by no means Marshawn Lynch good. This team has become Russell Wilson's team. This is back when Brady in those first few Super Bowls was the game manager, and then all of a sudden in 2007, Tom Brady became the man. Russell Wilson has become the man. He should have been more of a serious MVP candidate last season. Bringing that Seahawks team to the playoffs and this Seahawks team to the playoffs. They're going to the playoffs on the back of Russell Wilson. They would not be a playoff team without Russell Wilson. They wouldn't even be a good NFL football team without Russell Wilson right now. The case for Lamar Jackson is that he's a complete and total surprise. There were people that were mocking his ability to throw the football, and he's had signature wins this year against the 49ers, the Patriots, Russell Wilson, Seahawks, and he also played the game of the year versus the Kansas City Chiefs, and he barely lost this one. Lamar Jackson has proven himself to be better than what most people expected, and I think there's almost this sense of we were wrong about this guy, so we are going to anoint him as the MVP. And I'm not saying that's the wrong thing, I'm just curious as to why that is, because you were so wrong about him. Now that he's just good, you're like, he's great. I'm not saying he isn't great. I'm not saying he is just good. I just find that so curious that I think that because people feel bad that they doubted him at all, they're ready to anoint him as the next star quarterback. I do not think this is a one-hit wonder for Lamar Jackson. I think he will continue to develop. He will continue to grow. But a rushing quarterback will not last you a decade. Russell Wilson has a decade of work in this league. He has been to a Super Bowl. He won a Super Bowl. He lost another one. This seems to me his time to win MVP is right now. And I really like it when MVPs are guys who have kind of earned it. I'm not saying Lamar Jackson hasn't earned it, but last year, the Pat Mahomes phenom, that was great. He's threw the most touchdowns ever, so you had to give it to him. I like when the MVP is a guy who hasn't won one yet, who we all know is one of the best at his position, and we anoint him as the star he is. Russell Wilson should end his career with at least one MVP, and I think it should be for this season and for the Seahawks. I just think Russell Wilson carries more of the load for the Seahawks than Lamar Jackson does with the Ravens. Wilson is the man with the Seahawks, and he has to be clutch for his team to succeed. He's in the second stage of his career. Again, he's won a Super Bowl. He's been to another. He's been underrated for the past 2 years. He deserves to be noticed as the best quarterback in the league, doing the most with the least. Again, there's no Golden Tate. There's no Doug Baldwin. There's no Jimmy Graham. There is no star receiver on the Seahawks, and yet Russell Russell Wilson is improving as a quarterback. Most people doubt we would ever get to this stage of Russell Wilson's career. They all said game manager. They all said he's winning because of the Seahawks defense, because of the Seahawks running game. Russell Wilson is at that stage of his career where we should give him an award because of his growth as a player. I think that's what MVPs are about. And so many times in sports, it's like, let's just give the guy with the best stats and the best whatever MVP. I just think it feels better when a guy like Russell Wilson wins an MVP because we know what Russell Wilson is. We don't yet fully know what Lamar Jackson is. And I don't think Lamar Jackson is the biggest reason why the Ravens are winning. I think John Harbaugh and Greg Roman are the biggest reasons why the Ravens are having success this year. Greg Roman is the guy who went to a Super Bowl with Colin Kaepernick and went to a title game with the 49ers with Alex Smith. Greg Roman is an elite offensive coordinator. The offensive system, I believe, is why Lamar Jackson is thriving. I think if we had a draft of drafting a quarterbacks, I do not think Lamar Jackson would be in the top 5 of who you would pick. I still think you would pick Russell Wilson ahead of him. I still think you would pick Pat Mahomes ahead of him. And again, that's his value. This is the most valuable. How valuable is Lamar Jackson to the Ravens? Again, I think the minute he had that signature win against the Patriots, he became the favorite for MVP because he took down Tom Brady. We all thought that at the end of that game, Lamar Jackson would be back to being just another guy. But no, he proved he could beat the Patriots. He has had a phenomenal season. But valuable, I just don't see it. I think this year should be the year Russell Wilson wins NFL MVP over Lamar Jackson. That's just how I feel about it. Again, I just think it feels better when a guy like that builds towards his MVP. We've seen Russell Wilson have success. Also find it so odd we're willing to give Lamar Jackson all the credit in the world for the Ravens' success, but we weren't willing to do that with Russell Wilson because we thought Russell Wilson's teammates were better. He had Richard Sherman. He had the Legion of Boom. We were just like, you're not getting any of that credit. But we are willing to give Lamar Jackson all the credit. Last year, we are willing to give Pat Mahomes the credit. It seems like now, last year we were willing to give Baker Mayfield all the credit for Cleveland's success. We were never willing to give Russell Wilson the success he deserved. And I just don't understand why. We thought he was a system quarterback or whatever. I don't know what it is about Russell Wilson. We never fully gave him the respect I think he deserved. I actually see the start of their careers very similarly. Like Russell Wilson was put in a position to have success with Pete Carroll. Guess what? Lamar Jackson is benefiting from being coached by John Harbaugh. He also has more rushing yards than Mark Ingram. I mean, Lamar Jackson is having a fantastic season, but we weren't willing to say that about Russell Wilson. I just find it odd why we're like, this is the guy, is the reason the Ravens is having all the success. Because a lot of it, I think, with the MVP talk is about what was happening last season with Joe Flacco. The fact that Joe Flacco, after winning the Super Bowl, was abysmal for the Ravens, I think is affecting how we're viewing Lamar Jackson. We're like, oh, the Ravens needed this guy. He's their savior. I think we forget how good that roster was. I mean, they've also got Marcus Peters. They've had a lot of success this season. But also the Ravens have an organization. I think they're like the Patriots. They're stable. Lamar Jackson is benefiting from a stable organization the same way Russell Wilson benefited from a stable organization in the Seattle Seahawks. I think what's most interesting about these two quarterbacks is they're not throwing to star receivers. Neither of them have Julio Jones. Neither of them have DeAndre Hopkins. Neither of them are throwing to Michael Thomas. Russell Wilson and Lamar Jackson do not have all-star weapons. I mean, the best weapon on the Ravens is Mark Ingram, and he's been kind of a guy in New Orleans who's been up and down. Again, in Seattle, you have Tyler Lockhart and DJ Metcalf and Chris Carson, those are not household names. These guys are winning with not the best talent. Again, they don't have a Tyreek Hill like Pat Mahomes have. They don't even have a Julian Edelman type that's going to catch 90 passes. They are the best players on their team. Lamar Jackson is the best Raven this year. But is he the most valuable player on the Ravens? Like, could John Harbaugh do this with another quarterback or anyone else who wasn't Joe Flacco? I think that's something we seriously have to ask ourselves. How much of the Ravens' failure the last 5 years was on Joe Flacco versus how good Lamar Jackson is? Was it literally we could have done this with literally anyone else not named Joe Flacco? I think the answer to that might be yes. There's also something happening here with the NFL MVP is that we love to anoint the next guy. Last year we anointed Pat Mahomes as MVP, and rightfully so. I mean, he threw 50 touchdowns. This year, we want to anoint Lamar Jackson, where I feel like it should be about anointing the career of someone. Like Russell Wilson winning an MVP would be cool. Like the first time Tom Brady won an MVP, it was like, okay, he built up to that. These guys haven't built up to. I just think it sometimes looks silly if, let's say, Lamar Jackson wins an MVP and then the rest of his career is just not so great. It just kind of looks foolish to me. Again, that's not what it's about. It's about the season. But it's just cool to me when you look back on the career of someone great and you see those MVPs afterward. Like, it builds to that. Like, all of a sudden, LeBron James wins MVPs, and you're like, he is the best player in basketball. He built up to that. Kobe Bryant won his MVP. I remember how excited I was. We already thought he was one of the best basketball players on the planet. He already was one. But that was the year we were like, definitively, he's the best player on the planet. He was anointed that. It just feels right. You look at his career, and you're like, yes, that makes sense that Kobe Bryant has an MVP. Will it make sense in year 2 to give Lamar Jackson an MVP? Will you look back at that and be like, yes, Lamar Jackson's career was a career that I wanted him to have an MVP? I seriously think of it that way. I think of it as a career thing more so than a year-to-year thing. Like, that should build up to that. James Harden in basketball built up to his MVP season. Giannis kind of built up to his MVP season. Like, they kind of built up to be worthy of MVP. In football, I mean, you're giving it to guys in their year 2s, and you're like, I think Pat Mahomes will live up to being a guy who won an MVP. But will Lamar Jackson? That's when it starts to get a little bit dicey to me. Like, does the fact that Matt Ryan has an NFL MVP and Drew Brees doesn't, does that sound right to you? No, it does not. I think what's also happening here is Lamar Jackson is more flashy. We haven't seen a guy play like that before. Where it's like, even last year with Pat Mahomes, he was like throwing balls so far, you were like, what is going on here? I haven't seen anything like that. And then this year with Jackson, you're like, what is going on here? I haven't seen anyone play like that. Like, the flashiness, seeing something new can be breathtaking, and you're like, okay, there is nothing else. Where Russell Wilson's game is something we've seen before, but the way he's playing it, he has to play at an elite level for his team to win every single week. And the Seahawks are winning close games. That should be a signifier to how good Russell Wilson is playing. He has to play in the clutch. There is no quarterback better in the fourth quarter than Russell Wilson. Let me put it to you this way. If Russell Wilson and Lamar Jackson switch places, do you think Lamar Jackson would have success with the Seattle Seahawks that Russell Wilson is having with that roster? I think that roster is mediocre. I do not think they should have any right to be in the playoffs, and I think they are there because of Wilson. I do not think Lamar Jackson would elevate that team the same way. I think they would be like an 8-8 team, but I think Russell Wilson could win a Super Bowl with that Ravens roster. That's something I'm also looking at here. I think Russell Wilson is doing the most with the least right now of any quarterback in the league. He's not even playing with an elite defense. Their defense is mediocre. Baltimore's defense has elevated itself in the middle of the season. Think about what like Tom Brady's doing this year. The Patriots are winning on defense. Aaron Rodgers and the Packers are winning on defense. Russell Wilson is winning on what? Russell Wilson is winning on Russell Wilson. Lamar Jackson is getting help from his defense where Russell Wilson is not. I mean, the Seahawks were so desperate for an offensive spark, they traded for Josh Gordon and he got suspended again. That's what Russell Wilson is working with, where Lamar Jackson has some really good defenders on his team. They have Marcus Peters, Jimmy Smith, and Earl Thomas. That's an elite level secondary that's really starting to play really well in this right time. Again, I think the Ravens have a way better roster and they are real contenders. Lamar Jackson is playing with an elite level team. They are Super Bowl contenders. They are for real. Russell Wilson is not. He does not have the same level of defense. He does not have the same level of talent on offense even. No one in their right mind is picking the Seattle Seahawks to win the Super Bowl. And a lot of people probably didn't have them even making the playoffs last season or this season. And the reason they are in the playoffs is Russell Wilson. That's why he's the most valuable player, because what are the Seahawks if Russell Wilson goes down? I think if Lamar Jackson goes down, he's replaceable at this point. He's a second-year player. They're building an offense around him. The Seahawks desperately need Russell Wilson. I think they need Russell Wilson more than the Ravens need Lamar Jackson. I think the Ravens just needed somebody whose name wasn't Joe Flacco. And Lamar Jackson might have a good career. I think there's a possibility it could last longer than what Cam Newton did. There's a career that might last longer than Michael Vick did. But don't be fooled again if a rushing quarterback doesn't have the longevity of a Russell Wilson type. This Lamar Jackson phenom, you might want to buy now while you can, because it might not last as long as you think it will. Because there's probably going to be some injuries along the way. Listen, I think there's no doubt about it that Lamar Jackson is the most improved quarterback of this year. If you had told me that guy from that playoff game when he was awful would go on to beat the Patriots, the Niners, and play the game of the year versus the Chiefs this year, I would have called you crazy. He has definitely elevated his game. He deserves to be in the conversation for MVP. I definitely think he's the most improved quarterback, but I don't think he's the best quarterback. I still think there are a few guys ahead of him when it comes to that. I think he's the most valuable because so many people who believed in him are now like, see, I was right about this guy, so now we're going to name him MVP. And then so many others are like, I was so wrong about this, I feel bad, let's make him MVP. I think that's where we're at with this. I think Lamar Jackson is worthy enough to be in the discussion because the difference between the Ravens this year and last year is huge, and his development and growth is phenomenal. But still, it's year 2 of Lamar Jackson. I like the NFL when they made you wait to anoint that guy. We waited a while to anoint Peyton Manning as MVP, and then he had a string of winning a lot of them. We waited for Tom Brady to win those MVPs. The waiting game. Even Matt Ryan, before he won that MVP, there was a waiting game. I liked the waiting game. It seemed like they earned that MVP. They had a career you could look at and go, yes, there was a build-up to this MVP award. Adrian Peterson, Aaron Rodgers, there was a build-up. Those guys had great seasons before they won their MVP. If last year's MVP is Pat Mahomes, if this year's MVP is Lamar Jackson, that's 2 years in a row of giving MVPs to guys in their second years in the league. That just doesn't sit right with me. There should be a build-up to winning an MVP award. And the NFL has been so good at doing that. These past few MVPs have been that. They've been the build-up to someone great. Russell Wilson should be anointed the best quarterback in the league because he's been that each of the past 2 seasons. Listen, I would get over the fact if Lamar Jackson wins an MVP, but I would not get over the fact that Russell Wilson would never win one, because if you're not going to give it to him this year, then you're never going to give it to him, because this is a year he's without Doug Baldwin, he's without Marshawn Lynch, he's with Tyler Lockhart, DJ Metcalf, and Chris Carson. If you were ever going to give Russell Wilson an MVP in years where Drew Brees was injured, Tom Brady's having a down year, Aaron Rodgers isn't the same guy, Matt Ryan's on a terrible Falcons team, if Russell Wilson was ever going to win an MVP award, it would be this year. And I'm sad that it looks like he's not going to win an MVP that I think he deserves, because it's the build up to that. Again, he's won a Super Bowl, he's been to another one, he's played for the same coach his entire career. He's elevated his game. He is still continuing to grow and get better as a quarterback. But this will probably be his last great chance to win an MVP. And it's probably going to be taken away from him for Lamar Jackson. I get it. Lamar Jackson's a phenom. He's exciting. He's winning. The Ravens are a real Super Bowl contender. He's had signature wins against the Pats, Niners, and again, the best game of the year against the Chiefs. I get all of that. I still think it's wrong that Lamar Jackson will win an MVP before Russell Wilson. Russell Wilson is on that Hall of Fame path, and Lamar Jackson is just beginning his NFL journey. It just seems right to give Russell Wilson the MVP this year, because if you're not going to give him the MVP this year, it doesn't feel like to me you're ever going to give Russell Wilson the MVP. And that doesn't feel right. Russell Wilson should be the NFL MVP, but he probably won't be. It's probably going to go to Lamar Jackson. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Dead Podcast. I'm Cam McKinney. There'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and iTunes. So please rate, review, and subscribe.